Hello and welcome to a short gospel thought from me, Jabra Gidem. So, basically, I this is one of the things I've been hearing for the last couple of years, and that is this generation and others from previous generations do not want to be a part of organized religion in quotes. And as I study the Old Testament, I realize, every time I study it, this is not a new thing. This rebellion against an organization or an organized form of things is not new. The history of man is full of it, but as I always keep saying, the history of the children of Israel is a sample, is a model for all human history. And they are a perfect example to that. Now, I've written a lot of notes for this because my mind is just full of things to say about this. And I don't know why humans do not like organizations in general. We have people with we always rebel against the government. We always rebel against taxes. We always rebel against a church organization. It's not just churches. We always have this tendency to want to do our own thing, to want things to be as if this. When I think about it, as if to say after our own image. So the children of Israel, as I said, are a perfect example. They wanted to get out of Egypt. They wanted to get out of slavery. But once they felt safe enough, they immediately wanted a different God. They wanted to change the religion that they were committing to. Then they refused things. They refused the food when they were given the food. They liked it for a while and then they didn't like it, or they refused to obey the commands that were given to them about it. Like you can't collect it on the Sabbath, and they would go collect it. They are bitten by snakes in the wilderness, and they refused a simple solution because it was coming from this leader that they had this love-hate relationship with. They wanted meat, and when they got meat, they didn't handle it right. They didn't follow the commands that came with the meat. And so on and so forth. They reached the Holy Land, but then their hearts fail them, and they say, no, we don't want to go in, we're scared. But then they get the courage, and they go back in, and they almost get slaughtered. They wanted to go in when it suited them to go in. They didn't want to follow the orders that were coming to them from God. They always wanted to change things. Then they settle in the land, as we learned from the book of Judges. They settle in the land for a few decades, a couple of hundred years, and they have the system of judges. But then, of course, they are following Baal and Asherah all the time. And they go into the cycle that I talked about in the segments on Judges, where God sends judges who save them, then they fall God, but then almost immediately as the judge dies, they go back to the worship of Baal and Asherah. And Baal and Asherah were their forms of not only other gods, but other organizations and other ideas and ideologies that they would go to. The cults of Baal and Asherah, or the groves as they were called, even though we know about the horrible side of them, the child sacrifices, the sodomites on the mountains, the people walking through fire, they also had their festivals, they had their organizations of power, they celebrated abundance, they celebrated fertility and sex, they celebrated harvests, and so they had all these glorious sides to them. But they also had, as I said a few seconds ago, they exacted a terrible cost in the form of child sacrifices and diseases that came from sexual sins. And this is something that you get when you study the history of the times. And the way I think about it, family was always the victim. You remember the Jephthah, who sacrificed his own daughter. And as in all cults, as in all things that deviate from God, family is always is the victim. Family pays the terrible price of those kinds of sins. You continue to looking at the history after the judges. You had great leaders in the form of Eli and Samuel to Israel, and they were the prophets. They were the leaders of let's say, the church organization, the organized religion. And even though they were great prophets, at least judging by, in the cases of Eli and Samuel, judging by how corrupt their children were as priests, we can tell that the organization suffered. The organization of the Jewish church suffered because Eli and Samuel were not taking a stand against their own children. Not to mention, and I usually don't blame parents for the sins of the children, but these children weren't corrupt from nothing. There was some point where the parents didn't do their job, maybe. So, but the Jews, you might sympathize with them at this point under Eli and Samuel, and you say, yeah, they were right to going to Eli, to Samuel, and saying, we want a king. We want to have a new form of leadership. Now, what the Jews forgot, what the Israelites forgot, the children of Israel forgot, is that God is the king. And that's what always angered God, that God is at the helm. Even though, Israel, you have leaders who are not that great. You have Eli and Samuel. I still speak through them. They have their own lessons to learn, but I will speak through them. And you have to always remember that I'm your king, that you have to come to me. You have to come and ask me. The problem with Israel is that they wanted to have, in the vernacular, they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to have Baal and Asherah, and they wanted to have Samuel and Eli after him. But they also wanted God to be king. They had this, as I said many podcasts ago, they had in those days a form of worship polytheistic form where they revered many gods as it suited them. If I wanted rain, I'd go to Baal. If I wanted to have children, I'd go to Asherah. So if I wanted to have something else, I'd go to God. And so they always forgot that God is at the helm, that he is the leader, and in the end, his will is what will happen. Then moving forward, they get Saul, they get David, they get Solomon, they get the kings of Judea and Samaria that I've spoken about so far, some of them so far. And the story repeats. It repeats and repeats and repeats. Why? Because the people always forgot that the solution isn't in the organization. The solution is in understanding that God is the king and he is the source of the solution. And for the blessings to happen, they have to obey that covenant that they made with God at Sinai and later in Moab before Moses died. And God is king. He is the head. Worldly powers, riches, ideas, organizations, anything constructed by man is useless if God is not in it. If God is not at the center, if the covenant with God is not at the center, there is no solution, no matter what form. And so many people think, I'll leave organized religion, I'll be a good Christian, I'll be a good Jew, I'll be a good Muslim, and away from the organization. In the case of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have that thinking is that I don't want organized religion. I'll just go be a good Christian and that will be it. But that's not the solution. You always have to remember that God is at the center. And if if leaving the organization means that you leave God, then that's not going to work. Because God establishes his ways on earth through organizations that are led by imperfect people, by imperfect people. Now, so what do I learn from this? The people's task within an organized religion is to always remember that God is at the helm, to remember their covenants and to keep their covenants. It doesn't matter what's happening at the big scale organizational level and who's at the helm and what who's at the helm is doing or are doing. It doesn't really matter that much if we remember that God is at the helm. And as long as they tell us things that, go along with what God wants, then we're fine. Now, if there is a problem, that doesn't mean we sit on our hands and do nothing. We have to be a voice of warning. We can't sit and say, all is well in Zion. We have to be a voice of warning. We have to do it humbly and respectfully and always understanding that God is at the helm. And we shouldn't be just too invested in our own pride and make it our own crusade or something. We just have to warn. We do our best. Remember that God will take care of it because he is in charge. Now, what is the task of the leaders? Because the task of the leaders is, to listen, to be with the people, to also remember that God is at the helm, and to put the people who belong to that organization ahead of the organization. So what do I mean by that? So we have in the scriptures, in the Old Testament so far, we have, for example, the example of Eli and Samuel. Both had sons who were corrupt priests. They were doing all kinds of horrible things against Torah law in the temple, and people could see that. People could see that corruption. And the people did their job, and they came to Eli and Samuel and told them. But Eli and Samuel chose to just not rock the boat in the organization, keep the corrupt people in, and just move on. And the end came. Israel was defeated. The Ark of the Covenant was taken. The same thing with David and his son Amnon, who raped his half-sister. David didn't want to upset the monarchy, and so he didn't do anything for Amnon. And he let Absalom's pride and anger fester until it led to a rebellion and collapse of the kingdom that eventually came. Solomon, what cause is there bigger and better than building a temple for the Lord, building a house for the Lord? But the problem with Solomon, his heart was in the right place, but he went all out to build this fancy, magnificent temple and he didn't probably remember what God told his father David, that I was fine in the temple. I was fine with what Moses and Aaron and the earlier generation of Jews built for me. Go ahead, build the temple. But he made sure it was so fancy, so expensive that he wasn't listening to the people's groans, and his taxes and his investments oppressed the people. So these leaders, in every case, weren't thinking of the impact of the organization on the people, and they let the people just suffer, and they didn't take action. So that's the job of the leaders. That's what I learned from the Old Testament so far. And I think this will be the lesson, and there are many lessons we're still going to learn as time goes by, but to me, this is the arc lesson. This is the central lesson, that God is at the helm, and we should always remember that God accomplishes his purposes through organizations. If we see a problem in the organization, we need to be a humble, warning voice, do our best, do what we can, realize, do what we can and be at peace with what we can't do. If a problem is too big for us to handle or exceeds our abilities, exceeds our authority, then just remember God is at the helm and he'll take care of it. And what do the leaders need to do? They need to put the people first and listen closer to the people and put people before organization. Put the people before the organization. And if someone comes in with a warning voice, listen to that person. that's what needs to happen. This is the lessons we learn. These are the lessons we learned from the Old Testament. And that's all I have for now. Thank you so much for listening.